What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture. It's a place of history. It's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution.
For the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I hope you are keeping safe wherever you are. My name is Novella Ford, and I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs and Exhibitions at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture that's located in Harlem, New York. The Schomburg Center is celebrating 95 years as one of the world's leading cultural institutions devoted to research, preservation, and exhibition of materials focused on global Black experiences. And while our doors remain closed due to COVID-19, we continue to provide ways to access our digital collections and create online public programs like the one you are attending tonight. If you want to learn more about our programs or our digital collections, please visit our website at schomburg.org for more information. Tonight's program will be followed by an audience Q&A, so I want to remind you that we will take as many questions as we possibly can. So please use the chat to submit your questions. And those who are on Zoom, I do believe there's a Q&A box that you can submit your questions at any time during the broadcast. Today is publication day for In Search of the Color Purple, the story of an American masterpiece by Salamisha Tillet. So please give her all the virtual round of applause as well as hugs and light. I'm going to encourage you to please order your copy from our Schomburg shop online at schomburgshop.com. All the proceeds from the Schomburg shop supports the Schomburg Center as well as its many public programs. So Alice Walker's award-winning novel, The Color Purple, is a masterpiece. Full stop. I'll fight anyone who asks me any other questions about it. I actually only read the novel about 2 weeks ago, and I feel like I've been playing catch up ever since. At the time of its debut, some 39 years ago, there were critics hopping mad at its less than flattering depictions of Black men, as they said. However, what was lost in many of those critiques was the beautiful centering of a Black girl's story of rape and love and sisterhood and finding her way in a world bent on keeping her small. My brother sent me a text just about last week saying how much he loves the film. And as he gets older, now my brother is 5 years younger than me, with a quote, seasoned mind, he has a greater understanding of the themes in the film. Salamisha Tillett has brought forth a work that takes us behind the scenes of The Color Purple's evolution with coveted interviews with Alice Walker and Oprah Winfrey and so many others. This one is one for the culture. I want to thank you for tuning in to our virtual stage for the Between the Lines series as we get to celebrate the publication of this important work by Salamisha Tillet. As you may know, Salamisha is an astute cultural critic whose writings can be found in the New York Times. She is a curious and thoughtful moderator, and the Schomburg Center has benefited from her many appearances at the Schomburg Center as well as in our virtual space. She is a scholar and an activist. She's the Henry Rutgers Professor of African American Studies and Creative Writing at Rutgers University, Newark, and Faculty Director of New Arts Justice at Express Newark. With her sister, Scheherazade Tillet, she founded A Long Walk Home, an art organization that empowers young people to end violence against girls and women. Salamisha will be in conversation with political activists and feminist organizer and founder of Ms. Magazine, Gloria Steinem. She'll also be in conversation with Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall, who is the Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies and founding director of the Women's Research and Resource Center at Spelman College. The conversation will be moderated by cultural critic and writer Rebecca Carroll. And let me just say, Rebecca will also be celebrating the publication of her memoir, Surviving the White Gaze, which comes out on February 2nd. She has been a generous contributor to the Schomburg Center, and so we wish you all the success with this book, Rebecca. There is so much that can be said about each of tonight's participants, but I will allow them to do the speaking. Tonight, we will hear readings that kick off our program, first from Gloria Steinem, who provides the foreword to In Search of the Color Purple, followed by a reading from Beverly Guy-Sheftall, who provides the afterword. Then we'll hear a little from Salamisha Tillet, and then everyone will come together for a conversation. We are recording the program for the archive, but you, the audience, will not be part of the recording. Please be mindful of your fellow audience members in the chat, and thank you again for tuning in. With that said, I'm going to remind you again to purchase the book from the Schomburg Shop at schomburgshop.com. And now I'm going to welcome Gloria Steinem to begin our evening.
Thank you so much. I hope that all the technology is working, right? Okay. And I'm going to, 1 minute.
Right before you do, start your video.
Sorry. Okay,
There
I
you
was
go.
just saying, I hope all the technology is working, and it wasn't working. Okay. My fault. Okay.
You're with us now.
Thank you so much. And this is such an honor and such a great occasion. And I'm going to read from the book, partly because I think the book should always be visible right here, right? So this is a few lines from my foreword. I was on a long plane trip when I first read The Color Purple. Because I was lucky to have Alice as a friend and a colleague, her people entered my life even before they inhabited a book. I was doubly lucky because the long time span and intimacy of a plane trip allowed me to stay in the world in it until it came to a natural end. So by the time I emerged from the cocoon of that plane ride and The Color Purple, I knew I would do pretty much anything to help more people enter the world Alice had created, partly from her own family myths and stories, and partly from dreams. There were two accidental moments when I realized that this book about poor people in the rural American South would really be universal for people everywhere. Both were also meetings related to traveling, which, as you can see, I do a lot of. First, I was in Tokyo and happened to meet Yumiko Yanagisawa, who had translated The Color Purple into Japanese. She had fallen in love with the simplicity of Alice's writing and somehow managed to convey this in her own more formal and ancient language. I couldn't imagine how this was possible since Alice wrote as her people spoke, without even the quotation marks and apostrophes that let the reader and the writer share the superior knowledge that this was a dialect, not standard English. Yumiko told me with tears in her eyes that she believed it was the first time such simplicity was the unapologetic entirety of a great novel. Second, I met accidentally in an airport a woman who was translating Alice's novel into Chinese. Amazingly, she told me a parallel story. She had chosen some part of rural China for the language of its country people, whose speech also had not been used in a great novel in serious literature before. Ever since then, I've wondered if that translation included words from the famous Nushu writing invented by women in the Hunan province. Forbidden to go to school, they used this secret, woman-only written language to send letters to each other. If so, I bet Celia and Shug would have loved the idea of this, the only woman-invented language in the world, carrying their story. It seems just like the letters Celia wrote to God when she had no other friend, and then to her sister once she discovered her existence. I tell you these stories from distant countries because they made me realize something important. If you create one true thing, it stays true wherever it goes. I'm so grateful for this story of The Color Purple.
Following in my friend Gloria's footsteps, I'm going to read from the afterword. I met Alice Walker actually when I was a first-year student at Spelman and she was a sophomore. And when Salamisha asked me to write the afterword, I decided that I would pay tribute to the epistolary genre in which The Color Purple is written. So I wrote a letter to Alice as my afterward, and I want to read just a little portion of it. Here we are, Alice, 58 years since I met you, with our memories, our stories, our hopes, and our knowing that anything you love can be saved. Over 30 books, including a Pulitzer Prize, you are beloved here and around the globe for your writing, your activism, your unrelenting commitment to justice, and for always being yourself. You are a gift, Alice, to the universe because of your wisdom, truth-telling, generosity, reverence for the earth and all its inhabitants, and your deep knowing about what we need to do to keep ourselves and our communities whole. Even in the midst of toxic realities, war, poverty, racism, genocide, violence against women, cruelty to children and animals, you have never lost faith in the idea that anything we love can be saved. On our campuses, Alice, we teach your poetry and novels and essays, craft Alice Walker seminars, call your name, share with students your journeys to Brooklyn, Boonville, Rwanda, the Congo, Gaza, and home to Edenton, Georgia. My friend Salamisha Tillet's In Search of the Color Purple is a gift to the universe that painstakingly, meticulously, and lovingly describes all there is to know about the evolution of the novel, its characters, and its adaptation for film and the stage. It is a personal testimony to its healing properties and how it saved and helped to shape Salamisha's journey to wholeness. It beckons your critics to revisit their own rage and the sadness it generated. I hope that now Black women's suffering to make more legible, Black women's suffering is made more legible in the retelling of the story of your masterpiece. We love Shug and Celie and Nettie, and of course, The Color Purple, in Struggle and Joy, Beverly.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Beverly. Share my part now, even though it's really hard to follow all of both of you. So I'll begin. The first time I read The Color Purple, I was 15 years old and spending the summer in Boston with my dad, preparing to apply early decision to the University of Pennsylvania. I had just been let go from my part-time canvassing gig at an environmental law center because my boss realized that I was too young to be knocking on people's doors well past dusk. Since it was too late for me to pick up another summer job, I ended up answering phones, sorting mail, and volunteering at the local NAACP office. During my breaks, I'd pick up the latest of the weekly books that my cousin's tall, light brown-skinned girlfriend, Nicole, gave me to read. She was only 2 years older than I was, but already an English major at Penn herself, and sensing that I was on the verge of an identity crisis, she felt obligated to help me build up my armor of African-American literature. In turn, 3 books in particular determined my fate: Alex Haley's autobiography of Malcolm X, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and Alice Walker's The Color Purple. By the time I returned home to New Jersey to my suburban private high school that fall, I felt armed with a new vocabulary of racial pride and Black feminism. Walker's protagonist, Celie Harris, a dark brown African-American girl born in segregation, made all the more fascinating to me. Dear God, Celie opens the novel. I am 14 years old. I've always been a good girl. Maybe you can give me a sign letting me know what is happening to me. What Celie was unable to name was the fact that the man she called Pa repeatedly raped her as her enfeebled mother wasted away in the next room. You better not tell nobody but God, he warns. It'll kill your mammy. By creating a protagonist who was a victim of racism and repeated rapes, and also a figure who was eventually able to break her silence and tell her story on her own terms, Walker turned Celie into one of the most original characters in all of literature. I've gone back to The Color Purple many times since that summer of 1991. After I was raped by an African-American fraternity boy whom I was dating during my first year of college, and again after I was sexually assaulted by a near stranger on my college study abroad program in Kenya. Years later, after struggling with an eating disorder, contemplating suicide, and going to intensive therapy, I poured out all my anger and heartache in my poem, Do You Know What Rape Feels Like? As I retold my trauma, I leaned directly on Walker's words. Midway through my poem, I began in great detail to break down the intimate horror of my rape. Do you know what it feels like to have our howl silenced by a fist when you were rushed into, pressed down on, and opened knife? A blade so thick, so strong, so brilliant that your insides no longer exist? Scraped against insides bleed out into a yell that only you, like you, can hear. Screaming until it stops. No, until you think it stops. And then from nowhere, from no one, it keeps on. He continues to destroy your petals with his, you don't even want to say it. I broke my silence because of The Color Purple. At every stage of my healing, I found something new in the novel. Unseen themes or turns of phrases that ignored previous visits. When my sister asked if she could document my healing with her camera, I handed my poem over to her. A few months later, when she adapted her photographs and my story into the stage performance Story of a Rape Survivor, our actress, Rachel Walker, gave life to my words and let Celie's words be her creative guide. If Celie gave voice to in my teens and early 20s, it was Shug and her bodiness and bodily confidence, whom I needed in my 30s, as I entered a belated phase of sexual experimentation and exploration. And among the pantheon of women characters whom I introduced to my students when I first started teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, Shug meant the most to me. Her sexual fluidity and unabashed desires gave me permission to experiment unapologetically with men and women and long for more. Now, I live differently with The Color Purple. A lot more healed, yet still tender, I revel in Sophia's anger. Her rage at being doubly oppressed as Black and a woman fuels me as I raise and protect my Black children, a 5-year-old boy, and an 8-year-old girl in our age of unbridled racism. In the book, but especially on screen and on stage, Sophia captures my attention and dares me to be more like her. This is why every time I pick up the novel, even the one I teach from, covered by pastel stickies with its dog-eared pages, I feel as if it is for the very first time finding and falling in love with a new moment that somehow I missed before. I tried not to carry the enormousness of the novel's meaning for me when I finally met Alice Walker. I wasn't sure if I should remain professionally detached and not disclose my own experiences with sexual assault, or if I should tell her that I'd read every poem, essay, short story, or novel that she had published since 1970, and that she, more than any artist I discovered before or after her, gave me permission as a Black woman to be a full-fledged feminist. I was so afraid that my euphoria would spill out or that I'd fumble, that when my sister and I approached her haiku-inspired house standing at the top of the hill with only a bunch of periwinkles standing between us and her, I did not hug Alice Walker or thank her for writing the book that made my healing possible. Instead, I put on my writer's cap, introduced my sister as a photographer, and began to take notes. Gone were Alice's long locks. Now a short silver mane crowned her head, and she walked with an unbelievable lightness. And when she took us out on the back porch of Temple Juke, the name that she used for her house in our email correspondence, we three Black women stood silently together. Alice on the verge of her 75th birthday, Scheherazade, a newly minted 40-year-old, and I, a month into my 44th year, looked out only to see a crescendo of mountains standing between us and the horizon. After a minute, a deep inhale, and with a wry smile on her face, Walker asked, "Why do we need heaven when we have this?" And when I turned my head to catch her question, I realized that Alice Walker was the freest Black woman I'd ever met. Now I'd like to invite my good friend, Rebecca Carroll, to the conversation, and then Gloria, as well as Beverly.
Salamisha, that was so beautiful, so moving. I mean, you read stuff on the page, right? And then you hear the person who wrote it read it. It never fails. Even in this era of Zooms where we're trying to figure out how to adapt to this medium. That was just gorgeous. I want to start with, you talked about, or Gloria writes in her foreword how you said you wanted to write a book about the color purple as if the color purple was a person. How did that come to you, and how does one go about doing that?
Yeah, well, first of all, just thank you, everyone. Thank you, Novella and the Schomburg, for having us. And I think that was like really, I don't know if I knew that until I read Gloria's foreword, right? That the color purple, the book was going to become a character. I think I was obsessed during the process of writing this book and making sure Alice was a character, and then trying to figure out how her characters could become characters in my own understanding of her process. And so I think it's the ultimate compliment to say that the book becomes a kind of a living, Janet Mock says something similar, a living, breathing kind of figure in my constellation. So I think as a writer, the process for me, and maybe different than the way I talk about Alice, where the people come to her and they occupy her so much that she has to leave New York and then then leave San Francisco. I think for me, it's a deep process of absorption. And somehow the book becomes so second nature to me that it is a character, but it also feels like it has a life. And so part of my charge as a writer, I felt like, was to not only tell the story of how much this book matters, but also how much it's been reactivated and brought back to life by so many different types of people, whether it's Steven Spielberg and Quincy Jones and Oprah Winfrey and Danny Glover and Whoopi Goldberg, or whether it's Cynthia Erivo on stage. So I think all of those different actual living people make the color purple a kind of breathing character as well. So anyway, I feel like that was kind of what I wanted to do, but I wouldn't have said it that way until I read Gloria's words. So thank you, Gloria, for feeling that.
Yeah, and in tandem with what Gloria wrote and you're describing, it does feel, after having read the book, like The Color Purple was in community with us as readers. But Gloria, what led you to see it that way?
Well, I was trying to figure out just now as we're talking that why it is that I've always thought that books were kind of alive and had a life of their own. And I think it's because, for a series of reasons, because my family was always traveling and living in a house trailer and so on. I didn't go to school that much until maybe I was 11 or 12. And so books were my friends, literally. And I would sleep on them with, under the pillow, and they were literally my friends. And I do think that even without that experience, it's fair to say in a way that a book, a really good book, like Salamishah's book and like The Color Purple, is kind of like a person voyaging through the world, getting translated into different languages, meeting different people, and having a conversation.
And also sort of processing those different intersections with people and with family and with experiences. I mean, that is what we do as human beings, right? We go through this life and we have friends and we have lovers and partners and family and jobs. And I think that, you, Salamisha, you did a really wonderful job of sort of giving The Color Purple all of that nuance and all of that multi-dimension, so that it did serve and what Gloria and the way that Gloria described it. You talk, Salamisha, in your introduction about how Alice as a writer has been able to see the whole arc of sexual trauma, ancestral trauma, accountability, and that her perspective was shaped by a particular vantage point as a Black woman. And I think about this a lot, especially as we are living in this Stacey Abrams, the most memed woman on the planet. And the whole trust Black women sort of slogans and what we're coming out of. Beverly, what does the vantage point mean to you? What does that vantage point of a Black woman mean to you?
I think the first thing to say is that Alice is a Southern Black woman with a rural sharecropping background. And one of the things that she and I laugh about and say we have in common is that we are from the South. And I think that if you grew up in the South, I was born in 1946 and she was born in 1944. So we experienced Jim and Jane Crow, and that shaped who we were. She got involved in the civil rights movement at Spelman. I got involved at Spelman. So I think her Southern Black rural sharecropping background is significant. And Salamisha can talk about why we thought it was important, Valerie and I, to go to Edenton and be there in that place. And one of the things that we remember, Salamisha, from the party is Black people could not go downtown in Edenton, Georgia. I mean, could not go downtown, could not use the library. So Salamisha, you might want to say something about that in terms of the importance of place in terms of Alice.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Beverly. Well, one, thank you and Valerie Boyd for being my, I think I call you my feminist godmothers in this book, for traveling with me to Edenton. I guess I want to say that I am one of those people who kind of have to go to a place to understand the book that I'm writing. So it's part of my process as a writer. But when we went to Edenton, so Alice grew up on a street that Ward's Chapel, which you can see a reenactment in the movie, and then also her family cemetery. So it's all in one street in Edenton. And then we went to the place that she actually was born and raised. It's gorgeous. I mean, that was the thing that I think was really striking to me, just how utterly beautiful the natural landscape was on one hand. And then also to think about the deep poverty and the way in which Black people, to a certain degree, continue to live in really deep racial oppression in Eatonton. And so that juxtaposition between the glorious beauty of the natural landscape and then also the deep repression, I think made me understand this book in a way that I would never have if I didn't travel to Eatonton with you, Beverly and Valerie, because I understood that Alice in some ways was both trying to capture the complexity and the beauty of what it means to be Black and in South at that period of her grandparents' lives, and also the way in which she was trying to, so Alice Walker, when you read my book or if you read her work, she ends up moving to a place in Northern California that reminds her of Eatonton, but without the segregated swimming pools is what she says. And so that desire to constantly come back to nature and for Celie to kind of come back and redefine her relationship to God is so infused throughout the novel. And it's something that I know Alice Walker often says she doesn't understand why people often forget that this is a book about a woman's relationship to God and redefining her relationship to spirituality and then relationship to the land itself. That if you miss out on Eatonton, and if you miss out on the Georgia part of this book, if you miss out on the South part of this book, then you're missing, I think, one of the major interventions that she makes. The other thing, I guess, in terms of vantage point, is there's a great quote that she has that I quote here in the book, where she talks about what it means to be a Black woman, and that Black women are so at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? That the vantage point, and this is usually seen as like a problem, it's usually seen as a disadvantage. But through Alice Walker's writing, and I think through our experiences, from being so far from the center, you actually can see it all. And I think by giving Celie the power and the authority in an American novel, a Black girl who's sexually assaulted, who grows into her own literacy and grows into her own sexuality, it was a radical thing to do to American literature. And so I think that's also part of this vantage point thing. What does it mean for us to have to see the world through Celie's eyes? What is it for us to have to hear through Celie's words and then connect through and to each other through that vantage point? Is not just radical, but also it's one of the best gifts that I think a writer can give to the world, to ask us to imagine ourselves in another person's position. And that person who's as generous as Celie is, then redefines how we can connect and be in communion with each other.
I love too that you include the way that Whoopi Goldberg talked about Celie, and that Celie was so far away from her that it was easier for her to let Celie be who she was. And I feel like that also is very representative of the kind of arc and multi-dimensions of Black women that we are so often troped and put into monoliths, where there is this extraordinary arc both in perspective and in our experiences. And you also included the part about Black women writers and Toni Morrison's Sula and early criticisms of her work, and how the reviewer was like, maybe you can transcend that sort of nasty kind of limited title of being a Black woman writer. And it made me think of my first book, which the very premise of which is the culture of Black women writers, and that it is not limited. It is actually the complete opposite. Can you talk a little bit about what you draw from that collective and that idea of Black women as writers, both Beverly and Salamisha? And I'll come to you next, Gloria, with another question.
Do you want to go?
You can go first.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I guess one of the things I really enjoyed about the writing of this book was to see the community that Alice was in as she's writing this book, and some of her disagreements with her fellow Black women writers, like she's disagreeing with Audre Lorde, right? Audre Lorde's telling her, I don't know about that Celie character, and then yet we have this fully blown, fully flushed out Celie that dominates the text. So that was just interesting to me. But the question of vantage point and Black women writers and what I wanted to show, I think one of the exciting things for me with this book is there aren't actually lots of books in which we meditate on a Black woman creating a masterpiece. I think this is, at least in the mainstream world. In academia, there are many, many dissertations, and many academics have spent careers doing that. But in the general publishing world, there are books about Proust, there are books about Virginia Woolf, there are books where people talk about their own coming of age with a particular great, and I think Gloria talks about this a bit in her foreword as well. But for me, what does it mean to come of age with a Black woman's text that not only shapes who I was as a girl, but shapes my entire evolution into to womanhood? And so I think that's just one thing, right? Like, we all have these founding stories that help shape who we are, and The Color Purple was that for me. The other thing I want to say quickly is that, to the point of Whoopi, so Whoopi is like synonymous with Celie for many of us who've watched the movie over and over. So one, you're right to point out that it's a testament to her acting that she didn't feel like she was Celie. And it's also a testament to Oprah's acting, because Oprah identified with Celie and ends up transforming how we see Sophia. And so I think the ways in which people don't relate to these characters, and yet they become so synonymous with the characters in our imagination, speaks to their brilliance, but also speaks to the ways in which the dominance of that movie, and then later on the musical as well, which I guess we can talk about, because it does create it's a huge controversy when it comes out that now it's so celebrated, but Gloria and Beverly were in real time watching and witnessing Alice really be scapegoated for a lot of things because she dared tell this story in this way.
So I want to,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I hadn't thought about this before, but I'm glad you asked that question. My entire, I would say, professional obsession has been making visible the writings of Black women. And when I was an untenured person in the English department at Spelman, I actually ended up, without knowing it, publishing that first book of Black women writers called Sturdy Black Bridges. And one of the things that I really want to mention, Alice, like me, went through college without reading any Black women. And now that I'm looking in search of The Color Purple, one of the things that we know Alice for, which is hard to imagine now, she went in search of Zora Neale Hurston. We had not heard of Zora Neale Hurston in college. And Gloria, I'm sure you hadn't either. Most of us who would have gone to college in the 60s did not know. And so she searched for Zora Neale Hurston, which is the main reason that Zora Neale Hurston got read again. And when we were at Alice's 75th birthday, if you remember this, Salamisha, when we were not at her birthday, but Alice was the person who placed in Florida, is the first person who found Salamisha's gravesite that had not been marked. Zora's. That had not been marked, and got a marker for that. And I don't know if you were with us, Salamisha, but when we were at a Zora Neale Hurston festival, I think Valerie was there, we returned to Zora Neale Hurston's gravesite, and it was one of the most moving experiences. And so, like you who went in search of The Color Purple, Alice went in search of Zora Neale Hurston, and the rest of that story is legendary.
You bring up the movie and now, of course, or more recently, the theatrical release, the Broadway play, and how Gloria and Beverly were dealing with sort of the backlash in real time. And one of the things that happened, and this is obviously such a huge issue and conversation, but Black men really took great issue with the book, with the movie. And Black women at that time were tremendously suspicious, as you write, Salamisha, of the feminist movement. And so in some ways, Gloria, Alice's work was discredited because of her relationship with you, a white woman, and because she had been married to a white guy. And I think about that now because we're still struggling. White women and Black women are still struggling to connect in the feminist movement. What did that experience, what did you learn from that experience, and what could you tell fourth wave, or whatever we call them now, feminists, about that sort of, that dynamic?
Well, number one, how painful it is. To think that my presence would bring anything negative to someone I love, Alice, and to a great work like The Color. I mean, it was terribly, terribly painful. The only thing that was helpful was that at the same time, I had been getting responses. I used to wander around speaking on campuses, and young Black women on campus before The Color Purple, just when we were publishing essays, by Alice, would come up to me and say, "Do you know Alice Walker?" So the only the only upside is that you feel as if you can be a bridge in some way. And also that I'm learning all the time. When you were talking about Eatonton, I remember walking with Alice through a parking lot to the Piggly Wiggly or something like that. And a white woman said hello to both of us. And Alice was quiet as we walked. And finally she said, that was the first time that a white woman in that town had ever said hello to her. So
what does that mean though, right? That's really loaded. Your Black woman friend is telling you that in her hometown, white people had not spoken to her until she was walking with another white woman.
No, it is loaded. I mean, Alice, the novel, life, the best of it is when we begin to see through each other's eyes and begin to actually see each other. And ultimately, I think in my case, it often happened through Native American friends, Wilma Mankiller and so on, because it just made me see what bullshit it is, that a certain amount of melanin in our skin is determining. It made me angry on my behalf and on everybody else's behalf that we weren't visible as unique individual human beings to each other. And that's, all the more reason why we need to talk and be together and fight and see each other's point of view and expand our view of humanity.
Salamisha, along those same lines of the criticism that The Color Purple received from primarily Black men, notably Ishmael Reed, it reminded me of, as I was reading back over it, of this Vogue cover, of Kamala Harris, and that came out recently, and that it was shot by a Black photographer. Black folks are, up in arms about it. Like, we somehow are not, we're so protective of our gender roles, of how we look, of how we represent. And I wondered if you or in your research and conversations with Alice talked at all about how to please each other, if we can please each other. What does that mean? Because we're also such a community-based culture that it really gets into a difficult place. But I did think, like, wow, the folks who are coming at her about this are her folks, our folks, right? What's going on there?
I think Beverly and Gloria can talk about this too, but there are two artists that I think precede her. So Michelle Wallace, in terms of both being on the cover of Ms., but also having a book that ends up being both lauded and then also highly critiqued. And then Ntozake Shange's For Colored Girls, which comes out again before The Color Purple. And you start seeing a kind of trend in terms of Black women speaking particular truths to power and also being celebrated in the mainstream publishing industry or mainstream culture industry, and that being seen as a kind of tacit approval of a disenfranchisement of Black men. So there's this real, like, with the Color Purple, and even the book itself, even though she wins the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize, it's really the movie that brings everything to a kind of a storm, I would say. And so I guess there's a context in which, it's not just that Black men were responding to the Color Purple only because they were these, and not all Black men, but certain Black men, like we talked about Ishmael Reed in particular, or Louis Farrakhan, had really strong reactions to the book. But it's also the 1980s. It's Reagan. There's this huge, intense, racial oppression is deeply entrenched from all forms of government. So there's a way in which there is a context to put the backlash, I would say, but it doesn't in any way justify or excuse or make sense of it. And so I wasn't trying to fully, I want to unpack it so you can understand what Alice and Black women writers and Black feminists are always up against when you are talking about racial oppression and gender oppression as something that simultaneously constitutes how Black people live their lives in America. And so my point in kind of telling the story of The Color Purple was also like telling my story of having to find my voice as a Black feminist and have similar debates. And The Color Purple was still like a lightning rod for me when I was in college, and I was a sophomore and a freshman in college, and we're debating whether the movie was in fact anti-Black men, right? So I had to find my own voice as a Black feminist through debates with Black men and Black women about these issues. And I think hopefully we're in a really different moment around some of these questions and concerns. But I think for a group of us in the 90s, we were still embattled in these controversies. I also came of age with Anita Hill, like my senior year in high school was when Anita Hill testified before the Senate against Clarence Thomas, or with allegations of sexual harassment. So for me, it's like The Color Purple, it's like Anita Hill. Like if those are your formative experiences, then you end up trying, and then I'm a rape survivor on top of it and sexually assaulted by men of African descent. I'm trying to figure out how I can be in solidarity with the racial justice project, so to speak, and also speak truth to power in the ways that Black women continue to be oppressed inside and outside of our community. And I think this book is kind of like a reminder of how we came to be where we are, when we could have a Black woman as our vice president on one hand, when we could have a Black woman vice president on the cover of Vogue, and we're going to debate what that means. But that's a completely different moment than the 1980s. But I think the 1980s and these debates help make this moment possible in ways. But Beverly, do you want to talk a little bit more about the very intense, because I can only imagine it, but I wasn't in it. So but when you read Alice's work, it's so debilitating that she retreats in ways that we kind of forget because she's Alice Walker. But
I mean, one of the things that I think is really good about this book, because younger generations don't read this, Alice Walker was treated like a piece of shit within the Black, and not the lay community, but within the Black intellectual academic community. The NAACP in California treated her really badly. She was demonized. She was accused of hating Black men. She was accused of being one of those Black feminists, which means traitor to the race, divisive. And we need to remember that, how Alice was treated. And she talked about, the emotional toll on Alice as a result of how she was treated, including, by the way, by Black women literary critics. So I'm really happy, Salamisha, that you revisit that, because it is hard for my students, for example, it's hard for my students to understand how The Color Purple and the film could have produced that kind of venom. Someone who's very close to me, and despite the fact that I have talked to that person for over 20 years, says that he will never forgive Alice Walker. He will never forgive Alice Walker for The Color Purple. And so I'm happy that you asked the question, and I still am not sure, for example, why Black feminism why Black feminism is such a demonized political category and space. It's one of the reasons why Alice wanted to coin the term womanism, to
Yes.
make Black feminism
Yes.
palatable,
Right.
to give Black women and other women of color another term, because it was so demonized.
I mean, I remember discovering that womanist term and feeling like that worked for me, because I think what you're saying is, you know, Black feminism, the problem is that feminism itself was never Black. So then to suddenly say it's Black feminism is like, that doesn't seem to make sense. And what are you trying to tack on? And how are you trying to, you know, kind of emulate a feminism that never reflected us?
Yeah, but I disagree with.
But I think that speaks, Beverly, directly. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I guess I think that's why I kind of wrote the book, because I actually grew up with feminism as, if you kind of come of age with feminism in your family, within my family with Black women, and through The Color Purple, then you actually don't think of feminism. I mean, I say Black feminism, but for me, feminism has always been Black. Like, I actually don't know a feminism. I understand that there's a mainstream feminist movement that has historically excluded Black women and oppressed Black women, and that there are feminists who are racist. That's true, but that's not the tradition that I came through. And so I guess it's also, you know, if you find yourself through Celie and Shug and Sophia, or you find yourself through, you know, Ntozake Shange, for example, then you're gonna have a different relationship to that term feminist. So I think it's important for Black women who have grown up in feminist households, who grew up in feminist Southern households, right, to own that term, and not be the center, that the way that Black women have experienced and lived feminism is our center, and then everything else is from there. So sorry, I just wanted to say that.
I think that's a really important point, and I think that was the premise of In Love and Struggle, which we worked on last year. But Gloria, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, since we're writers, we love words, right? And the first poll that I'm aware of about what was then called not feminism, but the women's liberation movement, that was in, I think, 1973, the very first big, huge national Lewis Harris poll showed that the huge majority, like 90% of Black women, felt favorably about the women's liberation movement, and only 50-some% of white women felt favorably. So it's
that's different than feminism. That's different than
well, because
feminism.
of the Black liberation movement, but the women's liberation movement, right? So it has a lot to do with linguistics, and a lot and more to do with what we ourselves have personally experienced. Because, I mean, you know, actually, we're just trying to say, hello, we're each a unique human being, a miracle that could never have happened before and could never happen again. And this is not affected by the melanin in our skin or our genitals, or, you know, each of us is unique. And how to say that and create a community around that we're still working on it.
It is time. I've actually gone over a little bit with my time, but it is time to take some questions from our group of attendees, which is robust. Thank you all for coming out. So one question here, Sarah Ellen, says Walker, Ntozake Shange, Michelle Wallace, Angela Davis, and Maya Angelou all appear on an episode of the Phil Donahue show in the 80s, where they end up discussing negative reactions to their work. How does The Color Purple fit within this era of Black women's literary renaissance, especially since it comes later than some of the other Black feminist classics?
Beverly, you want to go?
Well, you know, the Color Purple, Black Macho, and the Myth of the Superwoman for colored girls, even Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, those works that came out in well, Third Life even in 1970, those literary works that came out, which we would call Black women's literary renaissance, were demonized because they dealt with patriarchy and gender oppression within the Black community. So while they were part of what we would now call the Black women's literary renaissance, they produced that controversy on the Phil Donahue show. They produced the Black Scholar special issues on sexism and Black women. So I remember that Phil Donahue show. It was explosive. It was explosive. And so it's hard to imagine now in the year 2021, it is hard to imagine the ways in which Black women writers and Black feminist texts and Black feminists were demonized in that time period. You had to have almost lived it. And the same thing is true with the Anita Hill saga in 1992. I mean, that was one of the worst political experiences in African American history, the way in which Anita Hill was demonized, and demonized by a community who supported Clarence Thomas. We supported Clarence Thomas against Anita Hill. So we have to say that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad she asked about the Phil Donahue show.
Yeah. I could say some other things about this, but in the interest of time, Salamisha, the first question of the Q&A that came in, I wanted to just make sure that we get to it. Is the title a tribute to Miss Walker's book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens?
Yes, and that was the first book that she wrote after The Color Purple, and it was her first full collection of creative nonfiction. And it's also the essay that she writes, the Looking for Zora for Ms., but then she republishes it in Search of Our Mother's Garden. And then she also has this really wonderful essay about the Color Purple and when the idea came to her. So though I obviously am a reader of Alice Walker and a student of Alice Walker's, as a writer, I think it's In Search of the Color Purple, In Search of Our Mother's Garden. Those two are really in sister text for me. So yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
From our mutual friend, Martha Jones, thank you, Salamisha, for this book. And thanks to you all for this amazing discussion. Salamisha, can you talk more directly about something that's floating through the discussion? How has the reading of reception of The Color Purple changed across generations? I'm most interested in how it's being read today.
That's a great question. Thank you, Martha. And I think Sarah Ellen was a former student. I think it's the same Sarah Ellen. So thank you, Sarah Ellen. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like Beverly's saying, it's hard for us to imagine how it seems so uncontroversial. And partly it seems so uncontroversial today. The movie, the musical, and obviously the book, it's because I think a lot of the issues and questions and concerns that Alice Walker put out in the world, not just Alice Walker, but all of the writers that Beverly mentioned before, Shange Morrison, Angela Davis, June Jordan, some of those things are now some part of our atmosphere, that some of the gains and the victories that we now take for granted are because of these hard-fought battles that these women waged in the 1980s and 1970s. But I would say that it's interesting because it's hard to, The Color Purple is like a really, really interesting story because it's been adapted to all these versions, and now there's going to be a movie of the musical that constantly reaches so many more audiences, but I'm not sure if everyone's teaching the book with the same veracity that it was taught actually in the 90s when I was in school. I teach the book pretty consistently in an introduction to African American class, but I think it's an interesting thing where everyone knows the movie, people have seen the musical, it's become beyond the moment of the novel, but there's something really special about the novel that I don't want people to forget. And so I think to Martha's question, over time, I think different generations actually relate to its iterations. versus the actual novel itself. And that's a weird thing, that this novel can be so ubiquitous and yet not as read as it once was.
Lesbian, this is from Andrew Ghibli. Lesbianism played a role in the book. Could you speak a bit about the place queer women held in Black feminism and the women's liberation movement, or if they were demonized too?
Yeah, I mean, I can hand this over to my friends on the phone on Zoom as well. But I do think the two things that were the lightning rods of the book, or I guess there's three things. One, it's writing in a vernacular, right? Having Celie's point of view be the entire way that we understand and read the language of the novel. Two, having really explicit scenes of domestic violence, but really sexual assault and incest. And then three, and I think Beverly says this is, Beverly, you and Valerie and I were trying to figure out over lunch one day what was the most controversial part of The Color Purple. I forget what you said, so I may be wrong here. But her relationship with Shug was extremely this is what people were trying to censor the book, ban the book. They're boycotting the book. It's not only had Alice Walker dare to tell this story of sexual violence, because we know that in Invisible Man, True Blood, the character by Ralph Ellison, who's a kind of folk hero there, he commits acts of incest against his daughter, right? He rapes his daughter. Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye also, but Cola's raped by her father. So it wasn't as if Alice had introduced this into the African-American literary canon for the first time, but what she dared to do is have a narrative of healing through Shug and Celie's relationship. And I think that double whammy, so to speak, created such a lightning rod that she dared to not only show the trauma, but then also offer paths of healing that were so taboo at the time that it just generated a backlash that was both misogynist and deeply homophobic. So I forget, Beverly, though, if you thought it was Shug, I forgot what you said versus what Valerie said, even though I think that's both, to me.
I think it was the loving relationship, and also Celie's first orgasm with, with Shug. I mean, that
was a huge deal. Yeah.
That was a huge deal.
Yep.
Let's just say it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And on that note, we have to bring this to a close. What a fantastic, marvelous conversation this has been. There are other questions. I don't know if Schomburg folks will be able to channel those somehow to you, Salamisha, Beverly, Gloria. But thank you, everyone, for the engagement and this time that is so difficult to engage with each other. It's just, it did my heart so good. So thank you all.
So agree, Rebecca.
Thank you.
I'm going to pass those questions on to you, Salamisha, if you want to answer them via Twitter or any of your social media, because I do think that there are some interesting questions there. In reading your book, it made me think that, I missed out on all of the classes around even just being able to talk about and discern The Color Purple. And so, if anybody's teaching a class that I can audit, let me know. Because I do think it's worth reading the book, regardless if you've already watched the film. I was someone who has watched the film many, many times, and reading the book, I felt like I got a further backstory of the characters, and it did not change my perception of the film at all. It actually just made me think the film took its own direction. But
they're two very different pieces of art, right? Yeah.
Very different, I think. And so wonderful to read these words and to read sort of the expansiveness of what she has put forth in The Color Purple. So I am now like #1 ambassador for The Color Purple. And then I read Salamisha's book, and it was just a perfect companion. It was like the person I wanted to talk to with the questions that I had about these various, the various types of the color purple. And so it was like I had this friend with me. And so now I need the scholarly, the folks who know a little bit more about literature conversation. But I just thank you all so much for this conversation. Congratulations again, Salamisha, on the publication of this book. Thank you to Rebecca and Beverly and Gloria for joining us for this conversation. I know that there are many more stops on your virtual tour, so if there's more that people want to hear about Salamisha's book, please check in on her website and her various social medias to find out. Again, you can buy the book at the Schomburg shop at schomburgshop.com. This is the first program of our public programming season at the Schomburg Center. Next week, we have the African Lookbook by Catherine McKinley, and she will be in conversation with Amy Saul, and I think that is going to be really fantastic. And anyone who is into Black comic books, speculative fiction, all the above, our Black Comic Book Festival actually starts tomorrow, and it's virtual, and it will go from Wednesday through Saturday. So again, visit the schomburgcenter.org if you want to find out more information. But tonight was wonderful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Until we all meet again, be safe.
Thank you.
Well.